Hello everyone, welcome back to our Accounting 210. In this video, we continue with the chapter 3, and then today we talk about learning objective 3.4 and 3.6. We leave 3.5 to the last part. So last time we talked about learning objective 3 and we did a practice. I hope you feel a little bit better after doing the practice. You kind of start getting the idea. How do we get the predetermined rate, and then how do we allocate the manufacturing overhead to each specific job, okay? Then today we kind of start working on the journal entry, and then I think we will use 2 videos to finish all the journal entries. Now let's get started. Learning objective 3, talking about the cost of a job and use it to make business decisions. So why we have to get the cost of a job, right? Like last time, why we have to get the cost of goods sold? Because it helps us to do these following things. It helps us to do these following things. I'm not going to really read here because you can say it helps us to bid for customer orders. So you kind of know how much your job costs, prepare financial statement. Allow discount because hey, my job, let's say my job cost is $10,000. So if currently it's $11,000, I can kind of give a discount to, buy a little bit, buy $1,000, but I cannot really go too low under my cost. And dealing with the pricing decision, I kind of know what my selling price should be. I compare my profitability, and then I also make sure how much my job in the future will be, so I can reduce non-related cost related with this job. So those are the reasons we have to get the cost of a job. Read the textbook, get a general idea just in case if I ask you in the multiple choice, you will select the right answer, okay? You are not required to write down these things word by word. Don't worry too much about this. Now we go to the second real meat of this chapter, right? I said learning objective 3.3 is the first important thing, and then learning objective 3.6 is the next important thing, journal entry. You definitely will have questions from this part. Okay, so before we talk about the specific journal entry, I want to go through this flow of cost one more time with you. We have been talking this many times. I hope you don't feel bored. You don't feel, oh my goodness, I have been hearing this many times. It's important. So first you purchase the raw material, right? So first you purchase the raw material. So you have this raw material inventory. Okay, so you have this raw material inventory. And then you have to use the direct labor. You have to use direct labor, and then also use the manufacturing overhead. You have to use this manufacturing overhead to get our working process. So we start having working process. We said ideally you want to get the exact amount of manufacturing overhead. But since it's not direct cost, we cannot trace it. We can trace direct material, we can trace direct labor, but we cannot trace manufacturing overhead. So we have to allocate our manufacturing overhead to the job. And then once you have that direct labor, you have allocated manufacturing overhead, you get your finished inventory. And when you sell it, after you sell it, you get your cost of goods sold. So how do we allocate our manufacturing overhead? We said manufacturing overhead has 3 parts: indirect material, indirect labor, and then other indirect manufacturing overhead. How do we allocate it? When our actual manufacturing overhead happens, so you have a kind of a swimming pool. Think about, visualize it like this. You have a swimming pool. You kind of have a pool that holds all of the actual manufacturing overhead incurs. So every time when you incur actual manufacturing overhead, you just dump the number in this swimming pool, okay? So no matter it's indirect material or indirect labor or other indirect manufacturing overhead, let's say you kind of have depreciation, you kind of have the utility bills. So the actual manufacturing overhead incurred, you dump it to this pool, okay? You dump it to this pool. And at the end of the project, you allocate, you get the water out from this actual manufacturing overhead pool and move the water to each specific job. When it really incurs, what's the meaning? Hey, watch this very carefully, okay? For the manufacturing overhead, when it really incurs, we kind of just increase our manufacturing overhead pool. And then when we allocate it, we take the water out from this pool and allocate it to each specific job. And then we allocate to each specific job. We have a job this, we have a job this, and then we allocate it to each specific job. So this is allocate our manufacturing overhead to individual jobs. There are two different concepts. First is when manufacturing overhead incurs. When we incur, we increase the water amount. When we allocate, we take the water out from this pool and then we put it to our specific job. Okay, so you said, kind of got the idea, but I want to practice with you. Okay, so now let's get started. We talk about the first part in this video and then we finish all the journal entry in the next video. So first ways, remember our cost flow most likely is when we first have raw material. So when you purchase the raw material, we assume the company order and receive the raw material during December. The company will make the payment later, okay? So we purchase on account. We don't pay it now, but we have account payable. So we increase our raw material. Our raw material is our assets, right? We debit our assets when we increase, and then we debit our liability when we increase our liability. So we have our raw material. You can just put the direct material. Your raw material doesn't really matter. Direct material doesn't really matter. We have direct material. You can put the raw material, and then we have account payable $90,000. Okay, we have account payable $90,000. And then the next one, use of direct material. Now you start using direct material. Remember, when you use direct material, you will make the material to what? It's not the direct material, it became your work in process. Okay, when you use the direct material, it became your work in process. So we used 72,000 of direct material during the month. So how does the cost flow? It flows from raw material to work in process, okay? So we decrease our direct material, we increase our work in process, okay? So those 72,000 will not be our material, but it become our work in process, 72,000. And then we decrease our direct material, okay? We decrease our direct material, 72,000. That is not our direct material. We move from direct material to work in process. Remember, whenever we use our direct material, we increase our work in process. We increase our work in process. Keep in mind, whenever a cost is added to a job, we have to increase our work in process. We have to increase our work in process. So that is our direct material. Direct material goes to our work in process directly. On the other side, if we have indirect material, how will this go to? Will this go to our work in process directly? No, because this is indirect material. This is indirect material. What should we do? We have to increase. The right way is we don't go to work in process directly because we cannot really know how much the indirect material goes to this specific job. What should we do? Is we first increase our manufacturing overhead. Remember the swimming pool? We have to first increase the manufacturing overhead. And then at the end, when we allocate it, it goes to work in process. Because at that moment, we will know how much specific manufacturing overhead should be allocated to that job. This is very important for indirect material and then indirect labor. For direct material, direct labor, it goes to work in process directly because you know that is specifically related with that job. So that increases our work in process for that job. But if it's indirect material, indirect labor, you do not know how much portion should go to that specific job. What you have to do, you first go to increase your manufacturing overhead. And then at the end of this job, you allocate your manufacturing overhead to work in process. So you will know, oh, this portion goes to this job. I stop here. It's very important. Read the textbook here. Read the handout, watch this video, watch all the My Accounting Lab video. Make sure you know the difference of direct labor and indirect labor, direct material and indirect material. One more time, I promise you, last time, indirect cost goes to manufacturing overhead first, and then at the end, when you allocate, it goes to working process. Okay, so assume you have 4,000 of indirect material, like the glue, like the lubricant, those things, indirect material during December. We don't know, hey, yeah, it happened 4,000, but we don't know how much goes to this job. You cannot say out of this 4,000 indirect material, 1,000 goes to that specific job. We cannot do that. So we cannot increase our working process. You have to wait until you get the rate and then you allocate. That's the right way. So when you have an indirect material, you never put work in process directly. If you do that, I will be really upset. Okay, I will cry. I will cry. You don't increase your working process. Instead, you increase your manufacturing overhead 4,000, and then you decrease the raw material. Okay, you decrease the raw material because you used it. You decrease the raw material. You decrease the raw material $4,000. You decrease the raw material $4,000. You increase the manufacturing overhead first when it incurs. When our manufacturing overhead incurs, you increase your manufacturing overhead swimming pool. When you have indirect material, you debit manufacturing overhead. When you allocate it, you increase your work in process for that specific job. Okay, so I stop here. Read this paragraph carefully. Manufacturing overhead is a temporary use to store the pool, you know. So later when we allocate, we get the water from the pool and then we put it in our working process. But when we incur our manufacturing overhead, we should debit it. We should debit it. All indirect costs, including indirect material, indirect labor, and other indirect manufacturing overhead, should be accumulated to manufacturing overhead. Should be accumulated to manufacturing overhead. So this is the key for the indirect material, for the indirect labor, and then for all the other manufacturing overhead, you have to first go to your manufacturing overhead account. You pour water in that swimming pool, and then when you allocate it, you know how much goes to this specific job, and then we increase work in process. Okay, I stop here. I see you next time. And if you have any question, hang there, finish the next video, and then email me if you still have any question. Thank you.